Well, thank you for being here. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Brad and I were just briefly kind of catching up before Kong and Sandy joined. And this was really kind of an idea that came out of my last conversation with Sandy. So when she has a chance to introduce herself, that Sandy's really been focusing on coaching in the area of grief and kind of working through that from a matter of just health and well-being and resilience. So she can speak more to that. But it really came up as a broader topic, especially when it comes to mental health and well-being and neurological health and well-being and physiological health and well-being, how it's all connected. And without giving too much away, I just want to go through, each of you are kind of coming from a different avenue of either health and wellness or human resources management. And even in the fitness realm. So just kind of having a discussion about what grief is. I think there can be many definitions of what that even is and what constitutes grief. And then how you each might approach it or how you've experienced it, and any sort of lessons and suggestions and recommendations for other people, especially this time of year, because the holiday seasons can bring a lot of emotion. And it can stir up a lot of unconscious neurological activity that really don't consciously hit us until an event takes place in our life that might be a holiday memory or something that might trigger those emotions. So since Brad and I were just talking, Brad, why don't you just kind of give you a brief introduction about you, and then we'll go Kong, and then Sandy, you can do an introduction and kind of your background on the grief coaching area.
Okay. Well, I started in corporate marketing and advertising agency. And so mine was all about trying to understand the mind from a marketing standpoint. And so but it drove me nuts that people couldn't make decisions and then would regret not being able to do it. And so it was before I got into what I do now, which is I'm a mind health coach and workplace wellness coach. It really was disturbing to me that why people couldn't make some of these decisions. And what I discovered is part of it is around grief, that we grieve for a lot of different reasons, both individually and collectively. The pandemic, what we've just been through, we're grieving for a lot of the change in our lives and things like this. And so my background, I've been in this for just 5 years now, and I'm learning on a regular basis. But I was the antithesis of a griever in the past, where basically I told people I had a Rhett Butler syndrome, where he said in Gone with the Wind, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, and so it was a situation that to really start to understand this and how the mind works and how we go through the 6 phases, because Kessler added one to Kubler-Ross's 5 phases and really helped him. It has just been eye-opening for me. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there and let others.
Yeah. Well, before we go to Kong, so you say there are 6 phases or waves or stages. They're kind of called different things. So what's the 6th one? So there was
it's denial. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Mm-hmm. And Kessler's son died, and someone asked him, well, have you gotten over, have you truly accepted and everything? And he said, it tends to loop back into those things because I'm still, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of my son and everything. And so he started studying it. And another level that he came to was to bring meaning to it. And the meaning was something that allowed him to have gratitude for the time he had with his son, rather than just concentrate. He still hurt from the death, but he was able to concentrate on all the blessings that came from that. And that was something that changed him and freed him in so many ways that he wasn't able to with what he and Kubler-Ross had done in their partnership.
Yeah. And even that interpretation. We'll talk a little bit more too. Like, how do we interpret even those? Sandy will
Right.
have some feedback too, like those stages or waves or phases. So Kong and I, we've known each other for quite a while, going back to just our activism days and with the Human Rights Campaign and different kind of community efforts. But we had a chance to chat yesterday a little bit because Kong really is coming from kind of that human resources. He's also, Kong, you're also a huge advocate just in health and wellness and diversity, equity, inclusion, and fitness, and just kind of self-care in itself. So why don't you give an introduction about you and kind of what brought you here today, kind of your experience and what you do?
Yeah, so thanks, Scott, for allowing me this opportunity to speak a little bit about my experience. Just full disclosure, I'm not a licensed therapist or a counselor, but happy to share my professional experiences in the realm of health and wellness, and maybe even from an HR standpoint. But yeah, so I've been around in the HR profession for the past 10 years, working with some of the world's top leadership development companies. I help them build out inclusive cultures and engaged in topics around employee engagement, productivity, which also involves, of course, health and wellness, and incentivizing employees to engage in activities as it relates to increasing employee morale in the corporate workplace. And so I'll stop there. Scott, is there anything else I should share more about?
Just even kind of connecting, this is something we can kind of talk about too. So when you think about your work in HR and we talk about morale, what is morale? Like that is really emotional energy.
Right.
Right. So we were chatting a little bit yesterday, how do organizations beyond bereavement, once somebody dies, what are the resources and support when people are going through health challenges or struggles that contribute, are part of the grieving process, like accepting changes in life that can be really difficult. So from that employee morale perspective, when people are really struggling, whether you've had any experience or resources connecting mental health care to employee morale, that might not be your area of expertise, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it's not my area of expertise to deal with situations where an employee has lost a loved ones. But what I can share is my experience seeing colleagues, that have to deal with those types of situations, which is that first and foremost, full sympathy to the person that has, lost a loved ones or going through some challenges in their life, right? You want to be able to create a safe space for them to come to you for any concerns or questions, and taking time off. Obviously, there has to be some dialogue between the employee and employer. From the employer standpoint, it could be comprised of the employee's manager and HR, and just thinking about a strategy that can work, where if we were to offer X amount of days to the employee who will be covering for that person. So there's also some arrangements that would need to be made from the management standpoint in terms of coverage. But for any company that values their employees, they have policies in place that is explicitly outlined in their employee handbook that would guide them, like, this is what you'll do to handle certain situations. And if they have further questions, then they could come to HR to provide more clarity. So for example, one thing that all of us can relate to is COVID, right? So when COVID hit, a lot of employers were wondering whether they should mandate all employees to get vaccinations. And there's so many state and federal regulations that employers have to abide by, and they're always changing. And so it's important for employers to keep up with these regulations. I've seen pros and cons of requiring COVID vaccinations for employees. But even before, when they start, they have to think about, like, what are possible pros and cons. From the positive standpoint, it is to ensure that employees, when they come to work, that they feel safe and that there are certain infrastructure in place to keep them safe. It could look like sanitizing the office on a daily basis, hiring cleaners to come in and clean every night, to ensure that the place is unaffected, and that all of that could really reduce the potential of liability for the employer. And then just some of the negative effects of requiring vaccination could be, if an employee has some religious belief that prohibits them from getting the vaccination, then you have to work with them to find ways to ensure that if they're coming to work and they don't want to get vaccinated, then there's certain consequences that the employee will have. And then there's also could be some legal repercussions as well, or liabilities. If an employee were to experience a reaction required to get a vaccine, then what does that mean to an employer, right? And so those are just some of the things that I've come across and what I've seen when it comes to employers handling situations like COVID, vaccination requirements and such.
Well, and really, I mean, as you're speaking to, it's the complexity within organizations to not just treat people as cogs in a machine, right? And I think that's the tricky part, because you're dealing with so many people that essentially make up that organization, but they're different people and different neurological, neurochemical, physiological people who could have different health considerations, different family situations, different religious beliefs, different everything, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. So it seems with this conversation too, is just to realize when it comes to what we really want to do with a lot of our diversity, equity, inclusion, even health and wellness, and talking about grief, is how do we build that resilience and that awareness so that when a crisis happens, we don't just throw all of our diversity, equity, inclusion out the window and demand conformity all of a sudden, and I think that contributed, I think, to a lot of the stress that people felt when they didn't feel maybe informed, or they didn't trust the information. They didn't know what the health consequences were. It really goes back to that sense of safety. Do you get that sense of safety from saying, oh, wow, everyone's been vaccinated, so now I feel safe? But if you don't feel the vaccination itself is safe, that's a whole other issue that's combating with that safety. So, how do you educate and inform in an unbiased way to really get beyond the different beliefs and different perceptions and all of that really is part of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And so just really connecting, again, the nervous system and and grief and change and stress management is just really important. And conversations like this, I think, kind of open the door and raise awareness about, we were just in that crisis, and what did we learn from it? What can we learn to kind of move forward and hopefully prepare ourselves better for next time? Because unfortunately, there probably is going to be a next time. So I love your insights and your feedback, and for being here too. So I'm going to move on to Sandy now. You've been patiently waiting. Kind of
I have to unmute.
yeah, kind of the seed planter of this conversation. So Sandy, share your background and kind of even who you work with. So I think you work more with individuals than organizations, but there might be opportunity, as well as people learn about your work, to bring you into organizational conversation. So why don't you introduce yourself and give some background on what you do?
Sure. Okay. So my name is Sandy, and thank you, Scott, for doing this. This is really impactful. We've been talking about this for a while, and I am a certified life and grief coach. I actually took on the work of grief because of a human lived experience of my life. So I experienced multiple losses, and so the pandemic was a wake-up call for me to go out there and be more in support of those who are going through those multiple losses, which is called cumulative grief. I'm the one that's more intense with that, because multiple losses is like, how do we grieve for the person that just died and then the next person? Because when this pandemic happened, so many people lost their mother, or 8 months later their father, and then another family. Like I've experienced that back in 2015, and I didn't have the tools and strategies now more than ever, that when the pandemic happened, I was gifted and open an opportunity to people asking me these questions. Wait a minute, I know a person. This is the girl that went through so much, but this was in 2015, but she's still coming up and still surviving. So for me, I decided to take on that world of helping individuals get into a place of being more functional after, because I don't take people right away that just lost someone. I will always offer them resources that they can go to for that. But after a year or so, I give people the opportunity to work with me and have the opportunity to really acknowledge their grief and find a way to reconstruct their new life adventures without their loved one's presence. And it's been a rewarding experience that I've had the opportunity to work with so many different people that have lost. And plus the holidays are coming and people are at me already. So this was the perfect time to do this meeting, because I was like, I don't need to do this week, but this time of year is hard. And I know there's different layers of grief. And with me doing this type of coaching for people, I mostly deal with people who've done loss, but it's so amazing how there's other people who are experiencing grief. What I've heard today is that some people's brains are so impacted. So, they start putting all that because they don't want to acknowledge it. And here I am, want to help them to open up their heart so that they can really acknowledge the painful experience they have instead of hold it in, because our neurological gets messed up. I was diagnosed with stage 1 cancer. So here I am, I survived, right? Because Scott was with me at that time. And now, because it's all about opening your heart to really, and our brains to really manage our minds to heal through those painful thoughts. It's just a temporary setback that we just need to work on and heal through it. Mm-hmm. And it's been a challenge, but it's been a rewarding experience for me.
Kind of going back to what Brad said too. I mean, with navigating it, when you're grieving, the loss, death is so final. That even if you're grieving through a divorce or a relationship issue, oftentimes that can be healed and mended. So you might still go through the whole neurological process of adapting to that new change and this loss of what you thought might be. But, you still have the person to work through it with you in some way. Maybe you don't get along and maybe you argue and you're trying to avoid each other. But with death, it's so final.
Yep.
And it's lifelong then. I mean, that it stays with you because, you don't have the opportunity to bring that person back and to have any sort of, another time, so, with you kind of working with people through the grieving process, I know you want to focus, I know ideally you want to try to focus on certain relationships, because even the nature of different relationships can induce different forms and manifestations of grief. So whether it's a parent who was this source of safety and security your entire life, to a child who, you might feel your job was to protect that being. And and the shame and the loss that even compounds that grief, to a sibling, to someone who's like your age. I mean, there's so many different forms. So who are the people that you work with specifically, just so we're more aware, kind of what's your
sorry
target audience?
I know, I forgot to say that. Yes, what I basically is I work with adult child grievers that have lost their parents or siblings. So I'm part of that because I don't see enough information out there, because there's more information for widowers and child loss. So for me, I took on to expand my mind a little bit on the parent loss and sibling loss. And I actually do some real estate folks too that went into probate and trying to figure out some of the legalities of what they can do with their house or not own, if they need to keep it or not. So I did expand it a little bit to do work with real estate investors and helping their clients to really get emotionally inclined to figuring out what's their best option for them, if they rather sell the house or not sell the house. Because everyone thinks I'm an agent, but I'm just consulting them in a way of helping them, because I know how that feels when you're in a process of probates or an estate planning. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so that's kind of, the other services that you need when you're going through grief, like legal.
The legality. I actually took on that because I experienced it, and I knew that this will be another opportunity for me to help others that want to understand what's their next step, because I didn't have that. And I learned all the stuff from, reading and all that, all the stuff I had to go through, and financial services and everything. So for that, I'm that go-to person to help them with the estate part and the probates, which some people find it's challenging, but it's rewarding. I keep telling people, I said it's rewarding.
Yeah. Well, especially when you're dealing with stress. I know, Brad, it looked like, did you have a question for Sandy or a comment?
You said that you generally waited a year after. And because of what we've been talking about, I mean, whether it's the pandemic that you're grieving or whether it's a relationship that you're grieving, I'm assuming that changes depending on whether it is a death or something like that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because that's the thing, that the grieving, the depth of grieving, whether it's a trauma that happened, whether it's a death that happened, whether it's just a misperception that happened, we're going through a grieving process. And until I got into it, I really didn't understand that myself, and did the research like you did.
Yeah, because some people do want help, especially where there was one person that said they just lost their family member. And I was open, but I wanted to see where she was. But she is in a place of deeper grief where she needs to, I offer her to go to bereavement counseling, because as far as Con was talking about the employee assistant program, I'm also an advocate for that organizations should have more days for them to grieve, because 5 days, I remember when I was in corporate America, they gave you only 5 days. And Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook actually created this place where people could have at least 20 days to grieve for their loved ones, a mom, a father, a husband, or a brother, because most organizations does only 5 days, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and this would be a question for you, Kong, too, if you know of any organizations or resources like this. But again, within the DEI realm, affinity groups or resource groups are a very common thing, and essentially they're support groups. You know what I mean? Without really being classified as a mental health service, or something like that. But taking that a step further, I mean, part of those experiences within within diverse communities is the grieving process. Is, if you've lost a loved one, if you've moved, I mean, maybe, you're a refugee, you're grieving the loss of your home, and leaving family behind, coming out, the process of coming out or accepting a family member. We were talking a little bit about that, the grieving process of just, really it's your nervous system shifting and your neurochemicals having to change to a new reality, to a new normal that maybe you didn't anticipate and you didn't see it coming, and your heart is wide open, but that doesn't mean that your nervous system it just is what it is. And you might still grieve the loss of a dream or that. So do you know if within organizations, like within the DEI, like, is there, like, are there any sort of modalities that include kind of support groups for, really, or even having facilitators in those resource groups and in those affinity groups that lead kind of support group discussions around kind of grief and emotional processing?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier about the employee resource groups and affinity groups. That's a good way to tap into that, that organization within the company and identify people that you can trust if you're going through grief, to discuss about some of those challenges and how that person could potentially help. And then there's also the employee assistance programs that Sandy mentioned earlier too, right? Like that comes with, the benefits of being employees. So don't feel shy using it. It's great to offer the program. What it's designed to do is, get you connected to, counselors and consultation services, to help address, grief or any emotional, mental well-being or illnesses. And then there's also, I've seen companies, they do work with outside, I don't know if they call it partners or vendors, as it relates to providing counseling. So maybe it's a good conversation to have with, someone in the HR department, to see if they know of, providers that they work with for the employee to tap into, to utilize as a resource. But, what I've seen through, throughout my career when it comes to, grief and mental health, which has been quite the focus in the workplace, ever since, we all experienced COVID. It's important for managers to identify, some of those characteristics that make up, grief or mental illness, right? And some of those components could be, an employee, missing work a lot. They have poor decision skills. The productivity is low. They're not as engaged with their work and with their colleagues. They're kind of like doing things independent by themselves. So those are signs to look at. And for, a manager who have seen those characteristics, might be a good idea to just poll an employee and just have a genuine, kind, and caring conversation with that employee,
Right.
not from a, hey, you're in trouble because, I've seen you, your work is low quality perspective, but more so like, hey, let's check in. How are you doing? It could be
Right.
a simple question is, how are you doing? And really providing that safe space for their employees so that their employees can feel seen and safe to share what they're actually feeling.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are just some of the, resources that I've seen, organizations have implemented. Again, affinity groups, employee resource groups, uh, you know, outside service providers or counseling providers that can help, and really leveraging the employee assistance programs. And if they don't want to talk about all of these things, they might want to look into, the employee handbook to see if there are any resources that they could, could check out without having to have a conversation with their colleagues or manager about these things.
Right.
That's the
Yep.
starting point too.
Yeah. Or, and that's the value of kind of the work that I and Brad and Sandy and other mental health practitioners that aren't necessarily clinicians or kind of the crisis counselor, but really from that coaching and mental well-being perspective that, I think people find speaking to us as a safer outlet, because they're not coming into a setting where they're being judged or trying to be diagnosed. That it's kind of that first conversation can happen with somebody that's just there to help you figure yourself out, that doesn't have to put in any code into the system to get you, to kind of to figure you out or fix you. And as you were talking about kind of the characteristics of grief too, like that's a really good point just to bring up as well, that in the mental health space, any condition is, and as the diagnostic statistical manual of psychological diagnoses keeps evolving, it's all based on behavioral, emotional characteristics. There's no blood test, there's no genetic test. So it's all observational and self-reporting that lump a bunch of symptoms or characteristics together to say, oh, this looks like this. But, somebody going through grief, that essentially could be anxiety. It comes with depression. It's not like they're separate illnesses. It's just really what your nervous system is going through and the reason why. So if you're going through grief, that will manifest in conditions like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, all these things that we clinically want to diagnose. But really the basis and source of that is grief and loss and trauma. And one of those characteristics can be difficulty dealing with change, anger issues, easily triggered. So these not so nice behaviors that oftentimes get punished and written up very quickly in organizations. It's not just somebody feeling sad in the corner that, that makes your heart bleed. It's that person getting angry at you that you maybe might take offense to, that's going through grief. And so it's just really that awareness about what are, like you said, what are those characteristics to watch for? And before we're quick to judge and to shame and to, punish those people, really to figure out, what are you going through, and to have those safe conversations that's contributing to this not so healthy behavior. That's not always about productivity. They might be incredibly productive, but also have suicidal ideation. So it's really that awareness of what are we looking for, and how do we approach it in a really safe way. And Brad, do you, working with organizations, do you have any thoughts or kind of feedback on that perspective?
Yeah, thank you. You brought up the DIE, and it's something that the belonging is what I'm seeing that is really going down on it. And part of it is the corporations and them trying to figure out what rules they should force everybody to do and everything, because there are people beyond the I had a situation where uh, our relatives, we've had a reunion every year. All of a sudden, they said, if you're not vaxxed, don't come. And it's that type of thing. And the companies are creating this lack of belonging. I've heard that and read that 80% of people are not reporting their feelings, but it comes out in that anger, or it comes out in that sadness that you described and everything. And I'm not sure how in a corporation to bring it out of somebody, because these people in some cases are being medicated to try to heal it, and because they're not willing to bring it up to the corporations. So that's still a question in my mind, and I'm in talking to a number of individuals, and clients, they will say, I've not reported this. I've not told anybody this.
Yeah. Well, it's health protection. It's HIPAA, So we're talking about grief and mental health care. And that's why I think it becomes a sticky widget, because we get beyond the, just buck up and the willpower, that when we really address it as mental health care, there are compliance issues involved, that you can't force anybody to report their health status, like there's sensitivity around health disclosure, healthcare information and privacy. And so it can be really difficult, especially organizationally, when your hands are kind of tied at how do you even figure out what's behind a certain behavior or behind a certain emotion, especially if it is a mental health issue, because there are compliance and privacy regulations that protect that. And especially if it's considered, even within neurodiversity, if somebody's on the autism spectrum or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or ADHD or anything, that really then you're getting into the, ADA, the American Disabilities Act, and those qualify for those, requirements that, might not be such a nice person, because they're struggling, they're behaviorally, they're struggling, but they need accommodations to help them in the environment because they have neurological conditions that essentially legally protect them organizationally from having accommodations. But unless we can have these conversations without the stigma and without the shame and the judgment that get involved, it's really tricky to navigate organizationally.
Yeah. So, Scott, you make such a good point about this, the stigma component. And one of the things I've seen a lot of companies done to erase the stigma around mental health, which also includes grief, is that, they have these programs that they have their managers go through to just educate, management about, mental health. And they have communication that they launch, just throughout the organization, just getting people to engage in these types of conversations and generate some awareness, so that if anyone does go through some form of mental health issue, that they know they're in a safe space or safe company to discuss it with someone within the organization.
Right.
So definitely, these initiatives within companies are important, to show employees that, hey, look, as an employer, we care, we want you to succeed, and we're here to help you manage, your grief, your mental health, your stress, and that there's help out there, so don't lose hope, right? And the other thing, I kind of want to mention too, is around, using the Family Medical Leave Act as a way to help employees cope through their process, right? For example, if an employee were to require, 1 or 2 days away from time to time and has requested in advance, may be a good idea to use some, some flexible time or sick leave for them to take those days away for them. But if they were to, take more than, a couple days, then, there might be some assessment that would need to be done, whether they should take medical leave or longer sabbatical leave. So this process that, companies do have in place for these types of resources that they can provide to employees as they go through, mental health or the grieving process.
Right. Yeah. Well, and to your point too, not only the policies and procedures, because that's a huge task for HR professionals to figure out and navigate, right? Like how do you maintain even consistency and equity, to make sure that you're treating everybody equally, and that you have those resources. But also to your point too, that management training. And I don't really know how much training there is for management. I mean, you'd think it would be the key component of human resources management is understanding the human brain and how it works and how to manage the nervous system and take care of the nervous system, because that's the human resource that you're managing, is that neurological being. But to your point, I don't know that all organizations have mental health training like that for managers as a consistent training component of leadership development, like knowing what are characteristics and signs of mental health crises or mental health conditions, neurological differences, just having that understanding can be so helpful. And Sandy, I was going to ask you too, and this came up in my conversation with Colin yesterday, and I'll ask you as well, Brad. So somebody who deals with this intensely emotional and heavy topic with people, how do you prioritize and take care of yourself so that you're not just taking on, as much as we talk about the importance of empathy, there's really the practice of empathy with boundaries, with healthy boundaries, that you can't possibly take on everybody's grief and pain and loss yourself. So how do you prioritize your self-care to do what you do?
It's all about cleaning up my thinking before I see these clients, because that's what my thing is all about: meditation and walking out, cleaning out all the judgment, or because sometimes when we're in that coaching mode, we get into that judgment state. But for me, I've learned to just clean up my thinking before I get into that space of dealing with hard, crucial conversations. That's going to be probably, but I'm holding space. I learned about cleaning thinking and holding space for the client. So it's all about my mentality, being sure that I am ready to talk about, because I get deep topics, murder, suicide. That was so hard for me. When that person came to me, I was like, whoa, okay, I'll give you an example of one of them. Yeah. So one of them was a murder suicide, and I didn't have a clean thinking on it. And I had to just break for a moment and just allow this person to just talk about it, just hold the space for it so that they can say what they want to say. But afterwards, I had to learn from that experience how to be able to clean up my thinking and not have a judgment attitude about what he's going to go through, because I was nervous to hear this part of his story of murder suicide, because I was just like, wait, this is not my area expertise. I know suicide, but I was like, I don't know. But for me, it's about really just having that clean up the thinking.
Yeah. How do you do that? Like, what are some practices that you do to
clean it up?
Do that? I mean, there's not really a broom.
I know, right? I journal my thoughts of what are my best intentions of the day? How am I going to show up for my clients? What are my true intentions to not try to fix it, but help them heal their mind and open their mind and their heart to really dive deeper into their conversation with grief. So I journal. I do a lot of journaling and walking around nature, and I talk to nature. I do. because it's fun, especially the birds. I'm like, oh, there goes a bluebird. Oh, there goes a red bird or anything. So walking in nature helps. But me, I journal out everything and write out what are my true best intentions in working with this particular client that's going to bring me the hard stuff. And they are coming with me with harder. I was just in the pressure of just dealing with the death, but when it comes harder, how do I deal with it? But that particular person made me give me the idea of I need to learn how to clean up my thinking. And so when you ask me that question, yeah, I journal it. I journal my thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great insight. I mean, I think too, people struggling with the grieving process, a big part of that is just, again, that loss of hope, that loss of anticipation of reward. Like there's no reward in sight. It's just pain and loss, right? And so I think you preparing yourself with that sense of hope, like where do I want to go with this person? Like, how can I maybe help this person? Even just that sense of hope from you can translate to the other person and create that safe space. Like it can be contagious in a way. Like if you come with that sense of hope and love and compassion, that it can calm that grieving nervous system in that way too, and provide just a little drip of hope for them as well. So yeah, so I really wanted you to talk about how you prepare for your client.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I mean, because
that's great. Yeah.
It's all about having that grounded confidence. So I had to ground myself to really learn how to deal with clients that I'm dealing with who are emotionally, painfully, and losing hope because they feeling like this is their only life support system. They don't have anyone out there. I mean, those are the same thing I'm hearing. And so now I'm getting accustomed to what I'm hearing. But when something like the murder suicide, that's when I had to learn how to be more present with topics like that, because that was scary for me.
Yeah. And there's no easy answer, right? Like your brain wants to solve the problem, but it's not solvable.
It's not.
Like you just have to be there to work through it. Brad, same question for you. Like, what are some practices that you do to take on the role of supporting other people's mental health and well-being?
Somebody taught me, and I don't know how to attribute this, but the question is the answer. And so you basically, I consider myself almost a professional question asker. And so I allowed them to really take it to where they need it to be. And it always works out. A lot of them just want to share. I feel for you, Sandy, on somebody saying, okay, we're talking about murder suicide. I haven't had one of those yet, but I've had some pretty traumatic things that to them was probably on the same level. It wasn't when you say it out loud and everything, but it really is being able to ask them those questions and not to have any sort of agenda going into the thing. And it's at times difficult because you sit there and you say, it's kind of like when I was running the peer groups, somebody would bring up an issue and I would know the answer. I was the facilitator. It wasn't for me to give them the answer to this thing. And at times to not go overboard on even suggestions and things like this, but to allow them to discover, because that's when I see the real healing happen. It's when they've discovered that they were a victim versus coming in thinking they were the perpetrator on something. It just turned around the whole situation. So I give everybody the acronym TIME to start your morning with Thanksgiving, inspiration, meditation, and exercise. And a lot of them taking their minds on a process like that gives them a new way to focus versus focusing on the hurt, which just creates more hurt.
Right.
Rather than on the healing, which these can take you into a different direction.
Yeah, and moving forward. Tong and I were talking a little bit about that yesterday. And Sandy, you're really good at this too, but it is that whole notion of that it really isn't about dwelling on the past. That's where the pain is, and whatever happened in our experience that has caused that trauma or that grief, but that it really is about finding ways to move forward. And that can be confusing to some people too. Dealing with grief, they might think, oh, I just want to let it go. Sometimes we might just distract ourselves from it too, and without really dealing with the pain. And then it hits us unexpectedly down the road when all of a sudden we're not distracted anymore. And then, we're alone, or we have some other emotional crisis, and then it gets compounded as Sandy deals with too, with that. What did you call it, Sandy? It was a compound.
Oh, cumulative grief. Sorry,
cumulative
multiple
grief.
losses. Yeah, I try to put it in third grade terms for people. Multiple losses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and to Brad's point too, I think that's a really hard part, especially for coaches and people in the mental health space, is that realization that the healing and the reframing of the nervous system happens within the individual. It's not something you can force from the outside. And that the best we can do is to provide reinforcement and guidance, but that neurological work has to happen within the person. So giving them the chance to make those connections, that's where the magic happens.
Scott, that's a great point, because remember when you and I connected yesterday, and I made sure that everybody has a different process in terms of how they go about coping with grief, right? Like what works for us may not work for someone else. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, when my dad passed away, a couple of years ago, I come from a pretty big family, and just seeing the amount of grief that goes on and how each of my siblings reacted to that passing was eye-opening. And so we can have organizations create these programs and build a culture of trust for employees to feel safe, that they can come to someone within the organization to discuss about these topics, but understanding that each person comes from a different background, and the way in which they connect with grief and manage it is different. Right. And that's one of the reasons why affinity groups is so important, is because they are the most engaged and productive employees in their organization. They're volunteering their time on top of their full-time day job to help the organization drive its mission forward. And so it's important to leverage these affinity groups or employee resource groups or business resource groups to get their collective thoughts on what can we do to ensure that we're creating a culture of trust, that we're being inclusive, that, to Brad's point, creating a sense of belonging, so that employees, when they do show up to work, that they show up fully, and that if they were to encounter any personal, professional challenges, that they feel safe to discuss it with someone within the organization.
Right. Well, and beyond that too, to really realize, I would even challenge to go a step further and go that the mission is to promote the production and absorption of serotonin and dopamine. Those are the drivers. Like, that's the neurochemistry behind that sense of safety and cooperation and engaging our prefrontal cortex when our stress response is full of pain and angst and worry and concern and cortisol. So, again, going back to organizationally, if the strategy is weren't going to enforce this new policy on everybody and treat everyone the same way, probably not going to have very healthy outcomes. And to your point, leveraging those affinity groups where there might be different strategies for different types of people, for different life experiences, and that it doesn't have to be one size fits all across the board. And so really just embracing that part of the human condition and leveraging those resources that we've developed, but I think we can utilize them a lot better, and make more use of them proactively, preventively, before a crisis happens, before we're in the midst of grief, to really just promote that level of understanding and safety and trust and belonging that is kind of the foundation of it.
Something to help people, because I know it's the holidays, and I guess when they do tend to watch it, but just to understand that when it comes to grief, occasionally you may get caught up in the virtual tsunami of grief, where for some reason from deep within erupts a tidal wave of emotions that you weren't expecting, don't fully understand, and certainly can't resist. And I just want to say that you do have a space and time for you to grieve, and don't let anyone tell you to get over it. Because in the past, I've heard people have told me that I should get over grief, and that it's in your best interest to grieve at your own time and space, so that you can heal at a place where you can open your heart and mind to new life adventures. And I understand, just like Khan said, people grieve differently, which is true. Yes, that is true. And especially different diverse groups too, especially community of color or anything. I've noticed some of their grief journeys and everything, and I see how they hit it and just focus on just working and forget about it, and then it leads up to anger or frustrations to other people. So that's what I wanted to add.
And I would just say, along what you said earlier, Sandy, the cumulative grief, break it into the parts, because so many people try to deal with this amorphous big thing, and break it down is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
grieve for each person. I know that there will be a person that you love the most and you want to grieve for that person, then go there if you want. It doesn't have to be, oh my God, but my father just died, I gotta grieve for this one. Then my mother died, I gotta grieve for this one. My sister. No, grieve at the most appointed, the person that you really have that, because for me, that's what happened to me. I know the part where I am still wallowing the grief of my mom. My father passed, but I'm just like wallowing in my mom's space, like, okay, Mom, I miss you more. But to ensure that you grieve that. But yes, Brad,
and to not feel guilty, and to not feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
When one thing is harder than another, and you feel like, oh, I should be feeling the same sense of loss, and if you don't, like, it's just your nervous system is what it is.
Right. I Scott, I would add that for anyone that's going through any form of mental illness or health challenges or grief, is to first understand that there is hope, and that there are people out there that are trained, skilled, and ready to help. You mentioned earlier, like, what are some of the resources that people can tap into? I just mentioned the CDC. They've done research on this. They have tools and resources that they can provide. It could just be a matter of just Googling, Center for Disease Control, mental health, and then someone could, find a list of resources that they can tap into. And they have a list, anything from, folks that are dealing with suicide, or disasters, distress, or abuse, or anything like that.
Mhm.
But just know that there's help out there and that there's, people ready to help, would be my final words.
Yeah. Yeah. And just, when you feel comfortable talking about it, that being able to talk to someone, it doesn't even have to be a therapist out of the gate. I mean, it could be the cashier at the grocery store who might give you, a little bit of advice or encouragement or resource. So just finding those safe resources, those human resources that are safe for you. It doesn't all depend on a title. We just really need that human connection to help with the healing process. And obviously the more trained, the better. But just to know, to your point, Kang, you're not alone. This world is full of people, and most of them are very eager to help each other. Even though we might not remember that or feel like it sometimes.
Scott,
Thank
if there's
you.
people that wanted to connect with us, where can they find us? Will you be able to connect them to us, or?
Yes, I will put all of your contact information and links to your profiles wherever this gets posted. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you for doing this.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
You
Yep.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.